When randomness determines the result of the game a great deal more than any choices anyone makes, the game becomes pointless and extremely boring. Alright everyone, welcome to my TED Talk on game balance. It only looks professional. It won't be. As such, you do not need to save your questions until the end. Just type them out, and I'll interrupt the flow of everything to deal with it. Alright, let's get on with it. Game balance. A HeyWoah PowerPoint. An interactive HeyWoah PowerPoint. So we can't start talking about properly balancing Age of Sigmar without first having an image of the ideal balance. Right? A concept of the ideal balance for Age of Sigmar. Oh, well that's a problem. It seems like there are differing opinions on what the ideal balance looks like. Whatever should we do? Well, have no fear. As the game designer, you start with your vision for the game and your first principles. These are things you care about that will be called back to time and time again whenever you're making just about any decision. They're your compass. They are your alignment in Dungeons & Dragons. And so whenever something is called into question, that's right, what was my guiding principle here? What was my vision? What are the things that I care about? What is my idea of fairness or balance or any such? This is similar to a movie script, in fact, where you have a premise for when you're writing a script for a film. Now, if you're designing a game or offering suggestions to change or fix or balance a game, and you don't in your head have an idea of all your first principles and the things you care about and your vision for it, your decisions for what you're going to suggest will be calling back to something. It's just it might not be intentional. Maybe you as a person feel that, fairness is 50-50, right? Or fairness is whoever is the most skilled wins or something like that. And you might not consciously think it, but that's what you're drawing upon for when you're making a suggestion for a change. A company or a game designer for a game will leave you clues within that game for what they feel is important. And so this is the presentation of their game and the descriptions of how to play, what the rules themselves kind of oblige a player to do, what the win conditions are. Changes that you as the game designer make inform what you care about and probably a little bit what you might do in the future, right? Whether you intend them to or not, this is all like communication. So let's talk about perspective. There are a bunch of different perspectives to have when talking about game balance or suggesting changes. The most zoomed out two are the player and the designer. And these two parties have different goals. The designer's goal is to make the game he's making the best game. And the player's goal when suggesting changes is to make their experience the best experience as a player of the game. And anything else they tell you is a lie. Sometimes it's a lie they believe. The most charitable players, like who care about other people's feelings, right? There are many, but really it makes them feel good that other people are feeling good. So is that also selfish? That's something for the philosophers to decide. And so here's an example of different perspectives giving suggestions for a change. Everyone remembers the activation wars. You saw a bunch of suggestions about what to do. Here's a Night Haunt player. And he said, the activation wars are so easy to fix. All you do is give Night Haunt strikes first. Easy fix. Like now no problem, right? Just give me the ability. Now, some other player, let's say an ogre player, says, the problem of activation war is super easy to fix. All you do is get rid of all always strikes first from the whole game. Like it just shouldn't exist as a mechanic at all. Just take all of it away. Problem solved. Easy fix. And then you had a Cities of Sigmar player, and he says, I don't see what the problem is. You just shoot the things that strike first with your 30 Iron Drakes. Are you guys dumb? This isn't even a problem. Nothing needs fixing. It's easy. And so none of these people are necessarily wrong. Well, okay, very often some of these people are wrong. But they're not intrinsically wrong. They're right for their position, right? So from their perspective, if that's the only perspective you're thinking about, each of them are probably right. Now, it's true sometimes that some people argue against their own interests, but it's usually not the case, right? Consider also that there are different players, and different players have different values. They have different ideas. Remember back in the other slide, they have different vision for the game. They have a different understanding of what is important and consideration of what is balanced. And so as a designer, players are useful. Here's a player on the right there. Now, players are very good at finding problems, but players are very bad at offering solutions to those problems. And yes, this is a Mark Rosewater quote. And the reason they're very good at finding problems is because they play the game constantly, right? They're more into playing the game probably than many of the designers even are, because the designers have jobs and a lot of players don't have jobs, right? And also the players aren't thinking when they're suggesting solutions as a designer. They're thinking about how to fix their exact zoomed in like single problem. And so I would take Mark Rosewater's quote and just expand it a little bit and say that players are very good at sounding an alarm when there is a problem somewhere, which may or may not be what they're talking about. It might be tangential to what they're exactly talking about, and it might be systemic. And as the designer, sometimes you have to determine what is the real problem, because the information you're getting from the player base, usually the loudest voices are the most upset voices. And there can be some things lost in translation. So let's say your player base is rising up and it says shooting is OP. Well, that's not technically true, right? Just as an example, your players are like, shooting is OP. We don't like it. It's not fun. Well, okay, but the problem might not be that shooting is overpowered. If you were a computer or a robot or something, you'd be like, okay, well, let's test that out. Let's find a unit that can shoot. Here's some Namarti Reavers. 2 units of 10. Oh, these seem to be terrible. I guess shooting isn't overpowered. What they mean is long strikes, when you're using a command ability to have them shoot twice, and then they rolled a double turn and did it again, that's what that's what tipped that player off, that event, to start complaining. But by the time it got to the internet or community feedback, the message became shooting is OP. So it could be that the actual problem is that this particular interaction between these 2 particular units is too good, and so something in that exact interaction needs to change. Or it could be that even that is fine, but the double turn is exacerbating some synergy somewhere, and it's not a problem when you don't go twice in a row. Or there's a certain level of shooting in the game itself that's powerful but okay, and it's just that this particular one stepped a foot over the line, and so we gotta pare that one down. So there's a bunch of different actual problems that it could be, but your message is shooting OP, we hate it, right? And so as a designer, you have to parse through all that, try to figure out what the real problem is, even before you start thinking of solutions. Night Hunt always strikes first. I mean, they technically do if they roll a 10. So there is that. You find it more a lack of ability to protect yourself from shooting? Well, it could be that as well. Speaking of the community rising up and sounding the alarm, sometimes when you preview something, everyone says, that sounds OP, that sounds terrible to play against, it's going to ruin the game, right? Every time they preview some army, there's at least something generally that everyone thinks, oh, well, this is it, this army is going to be completely not fun to play against, OP, right? And a lot of the times they're wrong, but often they're right too, right? Even when they're wrong, Crying Wolf is still useful data, because like when somebody says, Idneth Deepkin are going to be the most powerful army in the game because High Tide is OP. As it happens, the reason why IDK is so good isn't necessarily High Tide. Like, it has some stuff to do with it, but I would say it's the lesser of like the top 3 reasons. However, it's still useful data to hear people say that, because when people predict that something is going to be terrible, they're basically telling you what they don't want to see in the game. They're telling you their fears. And it's useful to know what your players are so concerned might exist in the game that they're willing to talk about some perceived thing as ruining it. It's just useful data to collect on people's opinions. Here's an aptly named slide. Balancing is a balance. How to say nothing. All right, here's the lead designer of World of Warcraft telling classic WoW players, he's actually answering questions at BlizzCon. And famously, a guy came up and asked the question to them, have you ever considered a server of WoW that was the original game as it was back then? So people can play like the original version of it, just as like a nostalgia thing, And he said, no. In fact, you don't want that. You think you do, but you don't. And it became pretty famous because a year later, they started working on Classic WoW. and then released it, and it blew all of their metric predictions out of the water. By some accounts, almost doubled their number of active accounts the quarter that it came out. Yeah, having him get pushed out onto stage and announce Classic was a bit of an eating crow moment. But so this isn't the worst response, right? Normally, he would be right in a sense. Not this time. Big not this time, right? But under normal everyday circumstances, he is adhering to a decent rule of thumb. Some of the more nerdy viewers right now might recognize the word Ungoliant. And that's what the players really can be. Ungoliant, by the way, is the dark spider, the spider god from Tolkienian myth. Mostly talked about in Silmarillion, but I think referenced in a book or two otherwise. And she had absolute maddening, complete hunger. It drove her insane. She had to constantly eat. This is like the ogre hunger times a million in god form, right? She would create offspring just to eat them, and eventually that wasn't enough. She couldn't wait. And in her madness, she finally devoured herself inside her own plane and died. And that's what the players can sometimes do if you just give them everything they want. That's the road you walk down when you just give players everything they want. And this is kind of because, as a designer, your interest is in the game as a whole and making the whole game the best, and the player's interest is in making their experience of the game the best. And it can very easily become a slippery slope into ruining the thing they love. So World of Warcraft community. Way back when you had to find, and this will be brief, I know this is mostly about AOS, but I used this picture, I gotta talk about WoW at least a little bit. W. Soren, big sub for 3 months. Appreciate the support, my dude. So way back when in World of Warcraft, you had to find a party by typing and talking to humans. Oh, we need a tank. All right, we got the tank. Oh, we need some DPS. Got him. All right, we need a healer. All right, let's go. And the players are like, that takes too long. I'm spamming for a tank for 20 minutes, 40 minutes, 2 hours. I can't find a tank. It's too much of a hassle. It would be so much easier if we could just, enter some queue and have a big list of everybody looking for that dungeon. And then you could just click on the people that are all looking on it, right? And then the group would be so much easier and faster to make. Oh, that's a good idea. That seems nice. I don't see why not. Sure. There you go. And then a little later, they're like, hey, this dungeon finder thing is pretty cool, but man, my server is really underpopulated. Wouldn't it be better if I just had a bigger player base to draw from? Can we connect some of these servers? And then when we form a group, we're all just in the same place and we do the dungeon, and all right, way easier, right? And instead of fly across the whole world, that would take forever. Can we just get teleported into and out of the dungeon? Sure, all right. Man, that's awesome. It's so convenient now. Now, whenever I want to do a dungeon, just press I on my keyboard, click, click, click. I'm a tank. I want a healer, 3 DPS. Got him, click. Now I'm in the dungeon. Let's go. Dungeon's over. Click. Back in town. This is so fun. This is easy. In fact, this is so fun and so easy. Wouldn't it be cool if you could do that with raiding as well as dungeons? Because who's got time to join a guild and juggle 40 people's schedules, or 25 actually by this time, or actually 20 by this time? And that'd be so hard. Can't I just click a button and do the dungeon finder thing, except for raids as well? It can be an easier version of the raid, I'm not gonna step on Johnny Tryhard's feet or anything. I just want to see the content, man. I just want to see the content with as little effort as humanly possible, that's all. I don't even need great gear from it. Okay, yeah, that sounds cool. That's really nice for people who don't know anyone yet, or they log on at strange times. So now you can do that with raids as well. But then you think about what is an MMO? Why is an MMO so special, right? And it's because you create actual real friendships in real life. And there's a sense of community there. There's an economy. There's people are notable on the server as being good or bad, or good people or bad people as well. And at some point, people kind of looked around in World of Warcraft and they're like, hold on. I just logged into the game, and I clicked a button, and entered a dungeon, and did the whole dungeon, and left the dungeon. And I didn't talk to a single human being. I joined a group with 4 people from 3 other different servers that I'll never see or talk to again. No one typed or said a single word for the dungeon. And now I'm back in town. And it's not like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game anymore. It's sort of like a single-player game that happens to have words and stuff above other people's heads. And so this is just a tangent to illustrate that sometimes when you give the players everything they want, they end up ruining everything for themselves by accident. And there are also different types of players that are trying to ruin the game for themselves by accident. Oh, just so you guys don't think I'm being unfair. Here, let me click the next one. There you go. See, it's both. It's both. Don't worry. Don't worry. So you have a casual community, and they want the game competitiveness to be in such a place such that anyone can win any game without spending any of the effort that may or may not be required to do so. Like, they want pretty much equal chances of winning a game no matter what you put into it as far as effort or skill or tactics or anything. Like, the ideal casual game is, look, we're just rolling dice, we're chill. The game's supposed to be chill, right? It's supposed to be for kids. You know, beer and pretzels, just roll some dice, see what happens. But the problem with that is if you listen to all of their complaints and appease all of them, the road you're going down is a game that at the end of the road, the winner of any particular game is pretty much just pure randomness. Like, somebody wins, it's actually a 50-50, and nothing you do really matters. And when randomness determines the result of the game a great deal more than any choices anyone makes, the game becomes pointless and extremely boring because there's no reason for anything. It's sort of like, why am I even playing? If anyone can win with any of their Warscrolls in their army, using any of their sub-faction rules, choosing any army, making any sort of decision in the game, right? If you still end up with a 50% chance to win, then you're not really playing a game. You're just sort of walking down a hallway and pulling a slot machine to see what happens at the end. You're like, you're running a program and just seeing what the number spits out. And that's incredibly unsatisfying at a base level for almost everyone, even very casual people. I feel it is still unsatisfying. Because a lot of casual people, they're not like, look, people got lives and jobs. Age of Sigmar is a dad game. It's a dad game. Don't let anyone tell you it's not. Age of Sigmar is played by and typically made for dads. You finish the lawn, put the burgers on the grill, play some Age of Sigmar where you don't have to grind for anything, you don't have to hope the dice roll your way, and let's just have some fun, right? And there is wisdom in a lot of what the casuals want, because tryhards are also trying to destroy the game by accident. So tryhards feel, if you take their suggestions to their logical endpoint, is that skill should 100% decide the outcome of every game. If you're better than your opponent, you should win. I mean, that just makes sense, right? Because when skill 100% determines whether or not you win, that means you can't get screwed. And getting screwed is bullshit. If you lose, get better. If you win, it's because you're a god. Your victory or defeat is entirely in your hands, right? There's no Deus Ex Machina come down from the scaffolding of the theater to deliver the win to your opponent out of nowhere, even though he doesn't deserve it. Conversely, when you make a mistake, you will lose, and that is as it should be. You know, all things in their right place. But what happens to a game when the better player always wins? A few things. The game becomes almost unapproachable by any new player ever. Wait for a first-person shooter to have matured for about 2 months after the most recent, 6-month patch, something like that, and jump into ranked games and see how fun it is. Join the game, get headshot, people typing, easy game. All right, well, let's try the next game, like land in the game, headshot from across the screen. Okay. You should consider uninstalling this game. You're terrible. And so the hill that you have to climb to even get to a place where you can sometimes win is probably more than a person who is fresh to the game is willing to put in, because they haven't quite been hooked yet. It's like Leonardo DiCaprio in the meme, right? You had my interest, but now you have my attention, sort of thing. Like, there's the two barriers to get through. To capture a player, you show them the models. Models look sweet. Maybe show them some lore or something, but then they see a game being actually played. And if the game then looks fun, it's sort of like and yes, ELO is the easy way to get and find someone at your level. Exactly. But these are just solutions that you can find to these two problems and more. So it's not like you're doomed if you start going down one or the other. There's ways to fix things. It's just different type. Yeah, and Quake especially, arena shooters. I was almost going to say Quake 3 Arena. Yeah, Quake and Arena are big ones because there's so many skills that just aren't normally a part of even first-person shooters with those. And like map knowledge and respawn timers of items and map control and predicting where someone is going to go. There's so much of that stuff involved in arena shooters. Makes them really exciting to watch, I think. But it also leads to very dominating victories, typically. Because if you kill the guy and get a full sweep, you're it's kind of like in Star Wars, you have the high ground. It's hard to unseat somebody who has the area advantage and the item advantage against you. But anyway, that's something else. Oh yeah, solutions. You could say, so some solutions. You could tell a player base to fuck off. If your game, look, we're not making a competitive game. We're just not. Tryhards go, just leave. Usually companies aren't about telling giant groups of players to stop paying them money, but it could happen. It's an option. You can also have 400 IQ tuning. Sorry for asking what's the topic. It's game balance. I'm doing a PowerPoint. New follower on Twitch, but I've been enjoying your YouTube videos a lot. Oh, thanks, dude. When you have some time later, can you ask a beginner question about armies? Of course. It's basically why I do the stream as a giant Q&A. And then I have topics and stuff to just fill in the gaps, right? You would argue that chess is also approachable because 90% of the players you will meet are beer and pretzels. Yeah, I would say so as well. I would say most people are decently familiar with the rules of chess, and that's about it, Probably haven't played it very often. Reflex DXT. Big sub, dude. I appreciate it. Thank you for the support. EVE Online. Yeah, there is that, right? At the time, original EverQuest, although actually at the time, was it really harder than stuff that came before it? Like Meridian 59, Ultima Online, stuff like that. Probably. Yeah, I would say it probably was. That's probably like a video game history question, I suppose. Yeah, the gulf between casual chess and bad serious chess is huge. Correct. But in Age of Sigmar, we don't have ELO. ELO should be on this solutions pane. I talk about it later, but I should have put it here, actually. You also have formats as well. Separate but rarely ever equal, yeah. This is something that Age of Sigmar has done. Remember that AOS has the 3 ways to play. They got open play, they got narrative, and they have matched. That's separating these groups of people so that they aren't butting heads as much as they might. And Magic the Gathering has kind of done this as well, with the idea of formats, where here's a bunch of standard cards, here's a bunch of non-rotating since a certain point in time, or just use anything. Using formats to kind of separate power levels and people. Extended for life, hell yeah. And ELO is one that chess did, and normally, chess would be particularly brutal when good player fights bad player, because I'm not going to say it's 100%, whoever the most skilled chess player wins, but it's about as close as you can possibly get, right? I know any given Sunday, right, that such a thing exists. How could you make an ELO system for AOS, though, when they don't collect any data whatsoever, really? You would have to start collecting data. The implementation of that would be somewhat problematic. I don't feel the will is there with Games Workshop in any capacity. We should try to have the game still be fun, right? Don't forget about fun. Balance doesn't necessarily mean fun, so it's your job to make sure it does. Yeah, FAQ. Fun at all cost. That's right. I tried fun once. Didn't care for it. Next slide, please. Eel's bad, man. Consider the eel. So here's where we talk about the importance of diversity. It is almost certainly a problem. You just spam eels in IDK. This isn't the only diversity problem in Age of Sigmar, but it is probably the most egregious. So the easiest example, hence. And one that I get a lot of messages at all hours of the day on some of my YouTube videos and in Twitter and in comments and all the rest. People see uninteractive and a lot of them think AOS is like this. Like, they look at that army and they're like, this is what Age of Sigmar is about, just spamming the same unit. Are there any armies that don't spam? In fact, I probably get the question, and this is the same question, it's just posed in two different ways. What are the armies that don't spam? Because I'm thinking about playing AOS, but I don't want to spam the same thing. What are the armies that don't spam? I get asked that question more than what are the armies that have the biggest variety of units that I can play? So see, it's like the same question, but one is kind of in the negative that implies that such a thing is the norm, you know? Nice, dude. Soren with the 100 bits. Why is diversity in Age of Sigmar of particular importance? Much more, I wouldn't say much more than most games. I mean, just talking about the business side of it, no emotions here, just logically. If you got a model that was sculpted by a sculptor, artist, concept artist drew it, sculptor worked on it, CAD guy made a CAD thing out of it, they blew it up into a big version to make sure it was all right, figured out how to take it apart, make sprues out of it, build a mold for it, produce said mold, make plastic prototypes for it, work out the kinks, all right? Start this thing in production, turn the factory on, there's a light switch in the corner, they flip it, and then the whole factory just turns on. And they make these things, put them in boxes, they hire a graphic designer to design what the box looks like, you know, they wrap the box and stuff, put it on the shelf. Might as well be a reason to buy it, besides just looking cool, right? Rate hamster Skaven 1 through 10, 1. So this is a hierarchy of how I feel the importance of diversity goes. The most important type of diversity is faction diversity, that all of the factions are reasonably playable, mostly because they contain a bunch of models. And we're trying to sell all the models, for reasons. And the second most important type of diversity is model diversity within those factions. Which is why, over here, consider the eel. Which is why spamming is generally a bad thing. It's not a bad thing if you're memeing. If you're some HeyWoah or Doom and Darkness floating out there on Twitch and the Twitterverse and the YouTubes, and you're like, waiter, 6 stone horns, please. Diet Coke. That's fine. Like, you're memeing. It's not the absolute, ideal way to play. But when it is, such as with the eel past 2 years, that is indeed a problem. Are you telling me 10 tanks isn't the optimized city list? A person even thinking about making 10 tanks is right there with the person thinking about making 6 stone horns. You're doing it for very different reasons than trying to win every game. Of a special personality. But also there's some other reasons why model diversity is really important, even within the same list, because you want the way you play the game to be aesthetically pleasing, for it is a miniatures war game. This is a battlefield you're on. There's a lot of terrain. They want you to play with a lot of terrain. Why? Because terrain makes the scene look cooler. There are game rules for terrain where they're trying to get you to use them right, but that's the carrot on the stick. The real thing is they want cool looking terrain on the table so that the game looks awesome. And a diverse model range for your army typically looks more awesome than just spamming the same thing, for the most part. Furthermore, it's advertising. When somebody walks past a game in real life, when you have a really diverse model range, you're seeing more of the range of that army, right? You're looking at products, right? And if you're only using the one thing, it kind of looks bad. You want the game itself to look awesome, and that's why you want a reasonable diversity of models as well. And the third and least important type of diversity, you'll note I've made it very small, is rule diversity. And I'm talking about subfactions, artifacts, traits, to a lesser degree battalions, although like battalions also inform the models you take, so you could couple that with models a little bit, right? But like what subfaction your army is, what artifacts and traits you've chosen, that's kind of important, but not nearly as important as the other two. Now, it's not important, right? They give you 6 subfactions in your armies book, depending on what book you have, where they have lore and history from those things. And somebody, that's what they get hooked on. That's the thing they fell in love with, is when they read about Iron Rock Enclave, or they read about Meat Fist Maw Tribe, or they read about Crematorian OBR. So they fall in love with some sort of the lore about these rules. And when that sucks in the game, that's unfortunate. And so it is still important to have the possibility for rules diversity, because some of those rules are attached to lore that are the reason somebody fell in love with that faction in the first place. But whenever these two directly oppose each other, then the models and the factions have to win out over the rules. But they rarely have to, because you're the designer. You can do anything. So moving on a little bit, but also talking about diversity, this is the same topic. This says, is there a place for bad cards? Because the example is from Magic the Gathering, but it also applies to Age of Sigmar. Is there a place, is there a reason for bad units? Like units that are like purposefully not very good. This is a question often posed to Magic the Gathering designers. Like, why do you have bad cards? Like, how come you have commons that are just like 2/2s for 4 with no abilities, stuff like that? And there is a place for them in Magic, because you have limited, you have drafting. And so you have different rarities, and you can make the rares and mythic rares much more powerful, much more interesting, because they're less common and can be less disruptive to the game in that respect. So when you're playing limited or something, you have very firm control on the percentages of people getting certain amounts of cards. And so there is kind of a reason for having bad cards in Magic. Oh, there's another thing. I almost forgot, because I'm not reading off of a script or anything. I'm just going on my outline here. Early on, some people said, well, there is a place for bad cards that isn't just limited. Also, bad cards are a teaching point. Like, it's important for players to get bad cards, and then they start accruing more cards and opening more packs and thinking about what they're going to put in their deck list. A bad card is a teaching point. Like, here, this one is bad, this one is better, now you've made a choice to use the better one. And when given the opportunity, you know, you have a player making a choice is probably better than a player not making a choice, because they feel they have more agency then. Anyway, I actually don't buy that at all, for the most part, for Magic. But the limited argument makes decent sense. But in Age of Sigmar, I don't really see a point for bad units. You don't play limited in Age of Sigmar. You don't draft. You don't have to control the secondary market. There's too many mythic rares. There's too many heroes or something like that. There's none of that. Even from like a power level perspective, for instance, so Noblars are probably some of the weakest units in the whole game. And I'm talking about like in their lore. You know, Noblars are probably some of the weakest beings you can play in the whole game, next to like a swarm of normal rats or something. But that doesn't mean the unit has to be bad, because you can have other jobs besides like, you know, being good at hitting stuff. You know, like there are alternatives, right? You can be a speed bump, you can be a giant tar pit, you know, you can capture something or have some silly effect. Like this isn't like a necessarily a power level thing. It's more like, is there a place for something that's like just kind of terrible? And I actually don't think so. Teaching point, a $60 unit sucks. Some things can be better at other things at certain jobs, but I don't know that there's a good reason for it. Snotling Pumpwagon. That is probably the most disgusting name for a unit I've ever heard. I mean, I knew it existed before, but every time I'm reminded of it. You think having something be not so great if it's the only thing that fills its particular niche is justifiable? Yeah. And so one of the helpful things to do when considering any sort of change is like, okay, consider the perfect world. Let's pretend, and this is like a shortcut for making some change. You know, in the perfect world, this is our outcome. And it's like a maze where you work backwards from the end. Now it's time for the designer to think like a player, which is like you're building your skate park in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and you click enter world, and now you're Tony Hawk, and you get to skate around and test it. That's kind of what you do at this point. And game theory is like, very briefly, what do the rules oblige you to do exactly? As if you were a computer trying to optimize everything. Because sometimes that's very different than what you intend on as a designer. Like, you intend for people to have their army fight another army and everything looks pretty nice, but the rules actually say that Like you can spaghetti strand your entire unit of 30 and just wiggling in a single conga line all over the battlefield. Now, that might not be how you intended the players play the game. And you might not even like that. You think that's gross, it looks dumb, I don't like that players are doing it. Well, you have no one to blame but yourself, because that's the optimal way to play your game, and so the rules you wrote, this is how you play it the best. And so at some point in the chain of rules writing, you fucked up, if that is in fact the best way to play. It's not the player's fault that they are playing the game how your rules tell them is the best way. The rules are talking to them. They're like, well, it seems to me that I want the guy here, I want to bubble wrap against stuff, and it doesn't say I just need one guy next to him, and so we'll string them out in a big line, and that's the best way to go. And so what did they do? They're like, well, now we're going to add wholly within to all sorts of stuff. And so now the rules are pushing players in the direction of how you want them to play. And 40K, I heard about 40K has a new coherency rule that is supposed to limit conga lines even more, because the rules writers of Games Workshop feel that conga lines are kind of gross. They're aesthetically disgusting. And it just doesn't look like proper combat, right? And I basically agree with them on aesthetics. It does not look good when it's conga line versus conga line. And so you should probably change the rules in some way to have it look cool. Once again, Mark Rosewater, the best way to play the game should also be the most fun way to play the game. And if the best way to play the game isn't the most fun way to play it, then the rules need to be rewritten. They've done psychological tests on gaming like this. Players will play a game in such a way that they don't even find it fun in order to win. Like, how many people actually enjoyed, in classic WoW, grinding rank 14, playing 8+ hours a day, every day, for 3 months? How many people, actually enjoyed that the whole time? Closing in on 0. But they did it anyway. Why? Because rank 14 gear was the best in the game for the next 2 phases. And you wanted to dunk on people. In other words, that's how you won. So players will do things that aren't fun to win. And then when they're done with it, they'll say that wasn't fun. And that's your fault as the designer. You might not have intended to, but you put that there. And sometimes you couldn't possibly have foreseen that people would be doing X when you wrote rule Y. And that's fair enough. The ingenuity of players to discover ways to play your game that aren't fun but technically are the best is nearly limitless. So, almost doesn't matter how good of a designer you are. The players will find some way to screw it up. But then you gotta rewrite the rules a little bit. You gotta roll with the punches, move forward. Players will optimize the fun out of a game. Well, yes and no, Kazadog. For some players, optimizing is the fun. That's the fun part. The fun part is figuring out what's optimal and then reaping the rewards from it. That's only for the geese right at the very front of the triangle flying, right? Everybody who's following them, they didn't have the fun of figuring out what the cool thing was, and they're not having fun because doing it isn't fun. So for 99% of people, the fun was optimized out of the game, but for 1%, they did the optimizing, and that was the fun part. And now everyone else is suffering. Same with the indie power gamers. Crunch the math, solo every encounter, that's their fun. Others just there to roleplay. Aha, plebeians. It is the patricians that power game, crunch the math, and solo every encounter while roleplaying 120%. There is no either or. Dominate the roleplaying and dominate the roleplaying with the other ROL version. Now we're talking. It is a false dichotomy. You like to optimize while still keeping to what you like, hence only 6 eels in your 2K IDK list. Yeah, I feel the same way, Hungry Panda. I myself have 6 eels in my IDK list as well. What's my opinion on how close the rules should be to the lore while still preserving the fun? Extremely close. Very extremely close. The only time it diverges is when the lore specifically talks about, for instance, in the lore, the Celestant Prime killed the father of all the biggest Mega Gargants with a single swing of Galmaraz, right? Should his Warscroll be that good? Probably not. I feel like the person who wrote that little bit carried away on the scope, right, of the power. But you don't want to, you don't want to rein in the lore writers too much, because being over the top, that's fully on brand. That's part of the GW brand, is being delightfully over the top with everything. Especially Age of Sigmar, because Warhammer Fantasy was over the top fantasy. Age of Sigmar is over the top fantasy, right? So that's part of the brand. Beast of Chaos lore is miles away from their rules, sadly. Yes, it is, and that is a shame, because Beast of Chaos have the potential to be completely metal, like so sick, actually. And the rules are a far cry from that one. Yeah, 40k might be a little more egregious, Galmara's example notwithstanding, where like 20 Ultramarines can conquer a whole planet. Yeah, I've heard stuff like that. That one is probably a little over the top. When you write stuff in your book like, one ogre is as strong as 5 normal men, like that's reasonably true on the table, especially if you consider what a normal man is. Like even a Free Guild Greatsworder is probably better than a normal man. Like they're in a different category. Dude has a flamberge, right? Procs mortal wounds when it crits. Giant codpiece, feather in the cap. Anyway, Warscroll Raiders. This is sort of an interfaction balance. Sorry, this is an intra-faction balance. And so how do you handle Warscrolls within an army? Warscrolls need a reason to exist. A unit needs a reason to exist. What is your job? What is your role? Why are you here? I suspect that the way they write Warscrolls is they look at the concept art and they look at the sculpt, and they use that to inform the things they write, balanced against some default averages for ranges of how good something is, relatively speaking, for each category of thing. And that's good. Do I think it's more accurate than Rob Symes' dartboard description? I think Rob Symes his dartboard is more judging the outcome rather than what went into it. And I mean, like, why do I want this model besides just it looks sweet? But actually, let's expand on that. It looks sweet is important. For instance, why does it look sweet? Think about the kind of person who would think that particular model looks sweet. Think about a slaughter priest. What's the psychographic profile? What's the personality of the type of person who thinks that looks so awesome that they want to buy the army? The same thing with Teclis, or Eidolon of the Storm, or Frostlord on Stonehorn, or Gluttons, or Hearthguard Berserkers. Yes, even Ale Guzzler Gargant and Snotling Pumpwagon. And so yes, you should tailor what that Warscroll does as somewhat of a puzzle piece. Not a puzzle piece, but like a job from Final Fantasy V. Look at the picture over here that I have as reference. Here's the Drow Elf here. He's a scout. Here's the big fire, big armor. Here's the tank guy. Here's some DPS with a staff. Maybe she's a healer. Unsure. Probably a sorcerer. No, a wizard. You see that book. Wizard detected. And here's a dwarf in the back. They each have their role to play, just as, ranged and speedy boy units and cavalry and flanking stuff and wizards and priests and monsters and teleporting and all the rest. These things have a role to play in some army you're making. But you obviously pair that up with not only what they look like, but also the personality of someone who would think that looks really sweet. And so let's talk about raid spots, choices, and equivalencies for Warscrolls. And this is pertinent because they just came out with the Marathi book, and the Marathi book changed some Warscrolls, didn't it? The old changin' of the Warscrolls. This is something they have historically been very hesitant to do. Mostly because the first time they did it, they fucked up real bad for entirely separate reasons. But, if you don't know the context or nuance of why, it might seem like, ooh, the players hate it when we change Warscrolls. When in fact, it was sort of like the timing and how you did it, although they were right to in the end. If they ever make rules based on looks, you want to know what person decided lead belchers should do 1 damage per shot while holding a cannon. Yes, exactly. Hey, maybe next book. And you could consider Warscrolls in your army like raid spots, where if somebody is DPS, you can do the math. People do the math all the time. And you get a pretty accurate bell curve of your expected damage against certain armor values. I use 4 as a baseline. Some people use 5. If you wanted to spend a lot of time, you could do it against multiple ones. And so now you have expected damage output. This is kind of like choosing between 2 DPS for a raid. Here's a warrior, he does X DPS. Here's a rogue, he does a little less than X DPS. Why would I ever want a rogue, right? And so the problem could be, in a book like, say, Cities of Sigmar, okay, here's a bunch of different hammers. You have Blackguard, you have Dwarven Hammers, you have Wildwood Rangers, Free Guild Greatsworders, Executioners, just like troops that happen to be hammers. And they're all, for the most part, reasonably close on points. Why would you ever not take just the best one? And to make the example a little more all-encompassing, also calculating all the synergies they could get. You're like, let's pretend I have all my synergies, and I'm comparing reasonably close points values for stuff. Like, all right, the Hammer has a Warden King next to their guys, and the Blackguard has a Sorceress next to them, so they can, why would you ever take the one that's not as good? And in World of Warcraft, you wouldn't. You just wouldn't. I mean, maybe they have some utility, or maybe they also bring a synergy. Like, here's Wind Fury Totem. Oh, cool. You don't do very good damage, but you got Wind Fury Totem. Hey, that times 40 warriors, that's a lot. So that would be a reason to take something that doesn't do the most damage, because it does something else. It fills a role, it's faster, comes with a buff for other things. It does something else. And then after that, like, there's more math you could do if you want. It depends on how in-depth you could go about how much you care about that balance. Like, MMOs go into great depth on, like, they sim everything out. Computers run simulations, fought for 100 hours and then took the average of all of that. And Age of Sigmar doesn't need that level of granularity. And they've, for instance, in raiding, like, they've determined that, okay, well, if your healer has no utility, they need to be exactly 15% better than a healer that does have utility, otherwise you don't take them. And so this healer does 16% more healing and damage than this healer, so you take them even though they don't have, they've broken it down that close. AOS is partially immune to Kevin Jordan's meta-slavery, which is what I'm referring to here. Kevin Jordan being one of the 3 original designers of World of Warcraft. And he calls this the idea of meta-slavery, when you inevitably have something that is the best. Like, that's just going to be the case for the most part, especially when you're talking about a specific job. Like, there is the most durable unit in Cities of Sigmar, and it's Phoenix Guard. If Phoenix Guard didn't exist, the next most durable one is now the most durable one. Even 5% difference is too much for an MMO, because people will start complaining at that point. In Age of Sigmar, a 5% lower output is well within the acceptable range of just playing the sweeter thing, because of how much of a dad game and how much the hobby matters in the game. And so luckily neither us nor the designers need to quite do that level of math. Players will, by the way, I do, when comparing 2 units. It may or may not end up making my decision between 2 units for me, but it's good to know. Anyway, the dangers of homogenization. This is the fear, right? Where, remember when we were talking about listening to players? Do a poll of Maw Tribe's players and be like, all right, this is a referendum. Vote yes or no on Proposition Ogre Maw Tribes 13. Should gluttons have rend naturally on their Warscroll? No, they won't go up 25% in cost. It's just, would you like rend? And everyone says yes, you should have rend. Okay. There probably aren't many units in the game where people are just like, nah, it's cool, I don't want rend. That's fine. I'm good, dude. These guys are just good enough. I am perfectly content. No rend here. But if gluttons have rend 1, why would you ever take lead belchers, right? Well, okay, that's true. So we should give lead belchers 3 attacks instead of 2, and we'll give them exploding hits, so they do as much damage as gluttons. And we'll give them rerolling charge like the glutton banner. Alright, but now why would you ever take gluttons? Because lead belchers just do the same damage as them. Oh, okay, so we'll give them some shady-ass shooting attacks. Alright, there you go. You would change lead belcher to be more elite and fill a different role, as would I, lead belch. In fact, it's lead belchers that should not have rend in melee, and it's gluttons that should. When all of your units perform just about the same job, the one that's the best is probably the one you're just going to take, especially if there's a big difference between them. This is kind of like the problem of Idoneth Deepkin, because their war scrolls probably didn't look like it, but they were very, you could argue that their war scrolls were kind of homogenized. Thralls, Sharks, Morsar Guard, Eidolon of the Storm, these 4 units, and Turtle. These 5 units, really their only job was damage. Like, they didn't really do anything else. Sharks did literally nothing else. They just do damage. Morrsar Guard just do damage. They have an electric shock, but that's damage again. Namarti Thralls, they get to choose a combat style, so they're damage, right? Eidolon of the Storm, or he used to have a reroll 1s to wound, which is kind of a synergy, but it's like the worst type, the most minor type of synergy ever. He's really just doing damage. And then the Turtle has an AoE cover thing, but you get that round 1 anyway, and you get that round 5 anyway. And you have a spell that can do that if you want. And cover isn't that good. And so all of those rolls are kind of like, you're really just melee damage. And when all of the units' rolls are just melee damage thing, well, the only thing you have to compare really is their damage per cost, their movement. And then some ancillary things like how many of them do you get in a unit for capturing, things like that. So Morrsar Guard were just destroying everything else, right? Because they did the most damage per point, and they were the fastest, and they still captured well. And so you could ask the same question twice, but get a little bit of a different answer. And that's, why is everyone only playing eels? And the second question is, why aren't people playing the other things? And they're two kind of different questions. You could answer them in the same way, but why are people playing eels? Because they're better than everything else. All right, why aren't people playing thralls? Well, because this, and this, and, you know, eventually they'll get to talking about eels, but they'll usually go through their reason that thralls aren't really worth it before then. And so with the new Eidnet Deepkin Warscrolls, they gave Eidolon of the Storm some minor actual synergy. They gave the Turtle some actual synergy, and they gave the Sharks not synergy, but a special rule that may or may not be useful. In other words, utility. And in a unit of Sharks, you don't have to choose all have one of the ranged weapons or all have the other per model, not per unit. So you don't have to double or triple up on that. And it's if you hit, not if you deal damage. So now you have like a reason to make a choice. Maybe you take Sharks and now the tactics on the table are focused on getting the maximum benefit out of that extra, like, can't pile in, cool, I'm gonna change up how I play. And for you, it ends up that those Sharks are better than eels would have been in their situation. You know, it allows people an excuse to play stuff they want to play. Because it is my opinion, you guys can answer, like, most people, they're not like secretly hoping that their favorite unit becomes overpowered, especially like a pet unit that has perennially sucked, you know, Sigmar, Lotan, things like that. Things that just kind of always have been bad. They're just waiting for a change to it that's good enough that gives them an excuse to run what they've always wanted to run. Even if it's not top of the mountain ideal. The opposite danger of homogenization is the unapproachable mountain of unrestrained complexity, which is like, if you don't know anything about Path to Exile at all, and you try to get into that game, it is rough. Like, just opening up the talent tree, it looks like a top-down view of Coruscant, the whole planet. There's system on top of system on top of system, and it can be daunting for a new player to approach something like that. I get this all the time with Warscrolls in the Stormcast Eternals book, where a new player is like, hey, just started the game. I got the battle tome for Stormcast Eternals, and you open it up and it like unfurled out of the book like in a scroll that went all the way to your door, you know? And you're like, oh my god, there are so many Warscrolls in this book and I'm brand new to the game. What's Rend? Like, I don't know what's good. There's 100 of these things. And so while you don't want everything to feel like it has the same job, and every army has to have a teleport, and every army has to have the Alpha Strike build, and every army has to have an anvil, and every army has to have good ranged, and every army has to have this and that, and suddenly every army is kind of the same. It's important to have armies that have different strengths and weaknesses and different ways that you build them to have different playstyles. Next slide, please. Competition is healthy, but also that depends on what your definition of is. Who is Daigo? Daigo Umehara is a professional Street Fighter player who was kind of like the best for a long time way back when. Had a viral fighting game moment with Third Strike against Justin Wong, the Wong Factor, what is known as the Daigo parry, and it got an entire generation of people into fighting games because of that moment, because it was so hype, basically. So on competition, we have data, and knowing is half the battle. And so what does a healthy competition look like? What is balanced? Many people probably have a bunch of different answers to this question because of, you know, slide 1, right? Where we talk about what your vision is for the game and what you feel is important and so on and so forth. And right now we kind of have stats. We kind of have metadata. What we know now is about half of what we could know, probably less. The collection of metadata is pretty much fan only. GW doesn't publicly do any of that because they care to do so. And there's tons of stuff that even if we had all of the data about win percentage and number of 5-0s and 4-1s and 3-2s and so on, and matchup analysis and number of trophies and all this stuff, even if we had all of that, there's a bunch of data that we can't collect because pretty much no one tracks it at all. How does an army's win percentage change based on what battle plan they happen to be playing on? If Age of Sigmar was a computer game, you could track all of this. And it would be a really useful statistic. Like, look at Knife to the Heart. Okay, what's the best army in the game statistically for winning on Knife to the Heart? Like, that data is somewhere. It's just people haven't collected it and probably can't. What's the worst army for Knife to the Heart? In the matchup specifically, Slaves to Darkness against Fire Slayers. Who's favored here? Are they 6-4 favored? Are they 10-0 favored? Are they 5-5? And then stuff within factions. On a metadata sheet, it just says Ogre Maw Tribes, right? How different is Yirlbad 2-drop, Stonehorns versus your army list is Tyrant, 8 Iron Guts, 8 Iron Guts, 8 Iron Guts, command point. So different, in fact, that, they probably shouldn't even be considered the same thing. And I think battle plan affects an army's statistics almost as much as matchup, or at least it can. And so we have, we know some data, and the data we have is produced by heroes, basically. But there's a lot of stuff out there that's really important that we just don't know at a more basic level. Age of Sigmar tournaments are kind of Swiss, right? But they don't feature enough rounds for a proper first place, right? And so the way we do our tournaments, which is inevitable, you can't have an 8-round Swiss cut to top 8 in Age of Sigmar. You just can't. That would, the game takes 2 hours to play. You just don't have the time. You simply don't have the time to do that. They had to get a little fudgy. They had to fudge things a little bit and be like, well, we'll come up with secondaries, so if you don't get all of your secondaries every round, you're basically out of contention. And we'll maybe come up with tertiaries too. And they used to do kill points, which is a really bad idea, and they stopped doing that for the most part, which was good. In the case of a time, maybe you look at opponent win-loss record like Magic. Maybe you look at painting or sportsmanship, or there's some ways that they're like, hey, look, we only had the weekend. It's a dad game. Everybody's got kids and jobs. The lawn's looking a little long. Gotta mow that lawn. Gotta go to work Monday. Can't stay here for 3 days, right? Maybe it's a Stein hoisting like it was at Wapaka. Whoever can hoist a Stein for the longest without collapsing, that was the tiebreaker for them. However you want to do it, I won't judge, but you got to determine a winner somehow, right? I'm making a quick little pit stop here in rules as intended versus rules as written. In a game with proper rules, there is no such thing as rules as intended. When Andrew Yells got me into AOS in 2015, I had never even heard of what rules as intended was. I'm like, what is this? I play Magic, dude. What's rules as intended? And he's like, oh, that's when they write the rule wrong and they don't fix it. So you have to guess what they intended. And I'm like, what? Just do what it says. The rule tells you to do something, you just do that. If they didn't intend for the rule to do that, then it's up to them to fix it because they're the company. Right? Especially for a game where you have like tournaments and stuff with. I don't understand. RAI is a really big thing in D&D. That's because Dungeons & Dragons rules, role-playing is like a cooperative narrative storytelling experience. And so the rules are very much suggestions. And in fact, in the Dungeon Master Guide at the very beginning, it tells you that the rules are suggestions. There's a paragraph, often a chapter, depending on the edition, that explains in no uncertain terms that you can freely change any of these rules, and the most important thing is that everyone's having fun. Even the rules tell you that the rules aren't the be-all, end-all. Nobody wants to decide a rule in the middle of a Warhammer match, nor should they. In fact, they're not really equipped to. One of the themes of this entire PowerPoint presentation is that you have players and you have designers. And it's, for the most part, outside of the player's purview to decide how some rule should work for the whole game. It's kind of unfair to burden the players with such a decision. It's not their job. They're not a designer nor a developer. A player can absolutely come up with a reasonable solution, and it's certainly possible for a player to detect what GW really did intend and come up with an errata or just a way to mechanically work it out that makes perfect sense. Sometimes the player comes up with a fix that makes more sense than GW's official errata, but we won't talk about that. All I'm saying is I think it's unprofessional to expect your player base to constantly make decisions like that when that's definitely your job. You're outsourcing that to players, and it kind of pits players against other players. There shouldn't be that friction of, well, I think the rule should work this way, and I think the rule should work that way. You're a jerk for doing what the book tells you to do, for playing by the rules, in other words. If the rule is really toxic, then the jerk is the person who wrote it, not the player who's using it, unintentionally or otherwise. You think it's awfully arrogant to assume you know what the rules designers intended every time? Well, every time, sure. Sometimes it's more obvious than others, let's be fair, right? Sometimes it's really obvious what they intended, which makes it even more hilarious what the as written has you do. It often comes by virtue of comparison to other effects. Yeah, but that too can be a path of of ill repute, right? So they're not always very consistent either. Rulings on similar effects. So it's just hard to know sometimes. Like, here's an army that's really difficult to play well, and if you don't play it perfectly, you get destroyed by everyone, right? But if you do play it perfectly, should that army be like the best army? This is a common design choice amongst MMOs and even to a certain degree fighting games. Like, here's the character that's really hard to play, but because of the toolkit they have, if you play perfectly, you should probably beat most people, right? Is that fair? Let's say they're actually just balanced between each other. So here's an army that's the easiest army to play, and it wins 75% of its games. And here's the army that's the hardest to play. And if you play it perfectly, you win 75% of your games. I work 80 hours a week, and I'm getting paid $200. You work 40 hours a week, and you're getting paid $200. That doesn't seem fair, right? Unga Bunga characters win anyway. That is becoming more common, ? In the efforts of fighting games to capture that new audience, there's a lot of Unga Bunga rewarding going on, isn't there? And it pushes competitive players away, because if there's one thing competitive players hate, it is getting randomed out. That wasn't skill. The only thing stopping Fox from dominating in Melee is all the good players are getting old and don't want carpal tunnel. Hey, it probably does apply a little bit more, to be fair, to video games and stuff like that than necessarily a tabletop wargame, right? It's interesting in the recent Blood Bowl articles, GW comes out themselves tiering their own teams and basically addressing it as, if you want a more challenging team, play this lower tier team. Oh, so what they mean by hard to play is it's just bad. And so it's harder to win. Yeah, I suppose. I wasn't thinking about it that way, but I suppose that's a way to spin it, isn't it? Sylvaneth, hardest army in the game to play. Really hard to play. You have to be really good to win with Sylvaneth. Parenthetical, it's just really bad. Hey, only the best players play Dan. Oh, I didn't think about that, but that is 100% solid gold sales pitch. That is awesome. And sometimes an army has a feedback loop of self-fulfilling prophecy, where people think some army is the best army, and they may or may not be right. So, the good players who want to win pick that army, right? And then what do you have? You have an army that all the good players who want to win real bad are playing. As such, they win a lot with it, kind of irrespective of how good that army is. Well, it might be true, and it is, right, that usually the best players also are pretty aware of what's good and what's not, right? So they're not going to pick something, they're not going to be tricked or fooled by the meta or anything. And you have armies like Beast of Chaos and Sylvaneth that are in that negative feedback loop instead of the positive one. People are like, Sylvaneth isn't very good because it's an underdog, and it is an underdog. It's not bad, it's just an underdog. And then people are like, oh, I don't want to play that, because I want to have good games and, blah, 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 right? And so the only people that end up playing Sylvaneth, for the most part, are people that, aren't aware of the meta very much, or, brand new and don't know too much. And people that are really brand new to the game or don't know too much, or it's their first tournament, tend to lose. They tend to have fun, besides losing, right? It's not like Magic where you go 0-2 and you actually drop from the event and drive home. That's not Age of Sigmar. Age of Sigmar, you're just kind of thrilled to play 5 games in a row and take pictures of people's armies and stuff, right? As an ogre player, you feel that ogres are the big noob slayer army of AOS. Are they the pub stomper, aka the noob slayer? I think a lot of armies could be, though. You could make that argument. I feel like the ultra defense armies are probably the biggest noob slayer. I'm thinking of stuff like Fire Slayers and Phoenix Guard, Cities of Sigmar, and Oziark Bone Reapers. Nurgle, probably, like Blight King spam Nurgle with Gutrot Spume. Because the way you beat super defense armies is by outplaying them on the battle plan and objectives, which is something that noobs don't know how to do yet. Like, it feels like you can't do anything against them when you're very new to the game. You roll up to 20 Hearthguard Berserkers or a bunch of, Mortek Guard or whatever, and you bounce right the fuck off and die, because they still do good damage. Once you got used to the game a little bit more, you realize, oh, okay, so their downside of slowness is actually, at times, a crippling downside. And if you can leverage that to your advantage, some games become like almost unwinnable for that slow defensive army. But as a new player, it's like, oh, here's your guys, here's my guys, I'm still getting used to rolling attacks, all right? And your stats just can't do anything, right? Because you're supposed to go a level beyond to beat those. Rolling one single die and having that kind of be the final, that's the last straw, the game is over. It doesn't feel like a satisfying victory when that happens, at least to the competitive player. Because as we know, competitive players, they hate randomness because it feels like their win or loss was out of their control and they want their choices to matter. That's the turn initiative, no? Yes, it exactly is. Yes, it is. But it's also exciting, and this is the push and pull. This is the push and pull of the priority roll. Having a very impactful single dice roll is hype. It creates hype. It's exciting. Excitement is fun. Hype is fun. But if you're like, okay, it's the bottom of turn 4. If I win priority on turn 5, I capture every objective. Oh, yep. Looks like you got priority. Therefore, you win by like 16 and it's a major victory. Even though we rolled one die to see who was going to win this game after playing for 2 hours. Yeah, it feels a little unsatisfactory, I guess. And it sucks for doing demos, exactly. And having stuff like priority in the game helps diffuse how skillful someone is or how much effort they put into winning or whatever you want to explain it from being too terribly dominating in the game. It's already pretty dominating. I can't remember who did the statistics on it, but they took a bunch of tournaments and they calculated a rough elo for the different players and did a little bit of math on it and determined that the player with the higher elo won the game something like 90% of the time. And so player skill has a huge impact in Age of Sigmar games for the most part. The point is that skill, if you're talking about elo of tournament players specifically, already has really a large amount to do with whether you win or lose at an Age of Sigmar game, that if you got rid of priority roll, that would probably make it worse. You Go, I Go has the tendency to make it easier to predict the future and think ahead. Okay, so, you're going to get 2 more turns, I'm going to get 2 more turns, it's just back and forth, so we do this. And it's kind of a foregone conclusion, you want to get a hot dog, right? And that's not like the greatest, victory ever either, right? Archetypes are something that I think are somewhat unavoidable in a game where building what you are going to play is part of the game. Is inevitably you kind of get archetypes in some way or another. This could be anything from something like magic archetypes, aggro combo control. Sometimes they get a little more granular, like mid-range, or when 2 of them overlap and you're halfway between them. And those are more like strategies, right? In AOS, you have Alpha Strike or Alpha Bunker, Castle Army. Shooting might actually be an archetype. Alpha Bunker being like a very defensive army that can teleport anvils right away and just sort of hunker down. And there's also Alpha Pin, which is you have the speed of an Alpha Strike army, but the damage isn't there. So you pin them in their deployment zone with beef, and they can't kill you or move anywhere, and then you slowly collect points. Like, there's a bunch of different strategies that arise to win in AOS. They're not, I don't think, as hard and fast necessarily as magic ones. And the problem with very extreme archetypes, When archetypes become rock, paper, scissors, that could be very balanced as a metagame, but very imbalanced for matchups. And when it's very imbalanced for matchups, it means that any one game is probably not very fun because you either dominate your opponent or they dominate you. Because real extreme rock, paper, scissors metagames are like everybody's 80-20 on their good matchups and 20-80 in their bad ones. Which means that whenever you're playing the game outside of a tournament, that one particular game is like completely blowing the other person out. And so sometimes when a metagame or a tournament is like super balanced, you also have to consider how fun are those individual games necessarily? How fair are those? The kitchen table, in other words, like it's probably not worth sacrificing one for the other. Do I have anything else with this PowerPoint, or can I just transition to answering questions to round out the night? Oh, infinite knob works. Here's where I was going to talk about all the knobs you can turn as a designer. For instance, battle plans could be, you find a certain type of army is doing too well in tournaments or whatever, you don't necessarily need to nerf it. You could just have the battle plans next season be a little more difficult for that particular army or that archetype of army to find wins on, you know. Like there's a lot of knobs you can turn beyond just Warscrolls and rules and errata and points. And it seems like they're kind of doing that, doesn't it? The number of objectives on the table has steadily increased as the game has progressed, which is pushing against the like, here, one giant killy thing and another giant killy thing, and then 750 points to support both of them. Like, I want you to spread out a little bit and try to control territory more, and giving bonuses for different types of units, right? Also, chat, don't forget fun. And the different things that different people find fun. Competitive people find accomplishment fun. Casual people find excitement fun. And creative people find expression fun. There's room for all in this game we like. And end of slides.